Well, this book came about in a very unusual way. I was asked to review a proposal by Sage Publishers out of London. And I'm often asked to review grant applications, book proposals, to review articles, to look at drafts of books and give feedback that have to do with online research. And so I read this proposal. It was a very interesting book proposal by Nigel Fielding. It was a handbook on online research methods. Nobody had done anything quite that comprehensive in the field, so I was quite intrigued. But after submitting my response to the book proposal, the editor called me and said, you seem to know something about online research that other people aren't talking about. Would you be interested in writing a proposal? So at first I thought, no, I really am not interested in writing a book. But then the more I thought about it, the more I thought, well, maybe he's right. Maybe I have a message and maybe there's something I can share that would be worthwhile for people. So I submitted a proposal. In the meantime, I was also asked if I would submit a chapter for the book that I had reviewed. So I, in fact, did write a chapter on online focus groups that came out in the handbook last year. And then I put together this particular proposal. Well, they were quite excited about it, thought that the linkages between technology and the online methods was really interesting and was useful for people, and that they didn't know of anything in the field that was out there as strongly linking the technology with the methods. So they asked me if I would do the book, gave me a contract. Now the contract asked me to do this book a couple of years ago, and I was really interested in doing it, but I couldn't quite get myself motivated, and it took starting to work with a colleague. I asked a colleague to work with me, Tony Schreiner, who is a senior systems administrator here at Boston College. And that was the oomph that it took to get me moving and to get the book to start coming together. Part of what I was doing and part of what I realized they were feeling from my comments was from my experience as a director in academic research services. Part of what I had done in my work was work with faculty and with grad students in particular who were doing online studies. And I served as that consultant, that technical guide that helped them ask the technological questions they needed to ask to put together their studies. And so essentially what we were doing, Tony and I, when we put together this book, was putting together an online consultant, so to speak, a kind of technical consultant to guide people in online research. I think that people who have a sense of what they want to do in online research will find this book immensely helpful in thinking through the kinds of technological questions they need to think through. What technologies do they want to use? How will their technological decisions impact their overall data collection, impact their data analysis? Do they want to use a service, for example, or do they want to purchase a software application and do it themselves? So on and so forth. These are the kinds of questions that people typically need to ask and don't always have the resources to even respond to these questions. That's what the book is designed to do, to enable you to ask those kinds of technological questions to be able to then address your research project. I suppose I could glibly state that the first chapter says it all. That it's really easy for me to kind of point that in that first chapter, there's the reason to read the book. But what I do in that first chapter, and what Tony and I decided would work really well, was actually to use a case example. So we used the example of a researcher that contacted me asking for assistance. And I walk people through the kinds of questions that this researcher wanted to know. And by the end of this couple of pages, you're either totally going to relate to this researcher and say, those are the questions I have, or you're going to put the book back on the shelf because it's not going to be the kind of questions you have, not the kinds of things that you're going to want to ask. From my experience directing a research organization, one of the things I discovered is that people don't always know what it is they don't know. They know enough to jump into a project. They know enough about the technology to understand how the technology might be useful for them, but they haven't necessarily pulled it all together. And so 9 out of 10 times, all it takes is that little extra subtle addition to help them get over a hump, to have a successful project. That's where the book is really organized and focused, to help people get over that hump, to help them avoid mistakes that could have been easily rectified if they just knew what questions to ask at the very beginning, the outset of their problems. So, for example, ways the book can help. If you're thinking about hiring somebody to help you with your project, what kind of skills do you need? What kinds of things do you want this person to bring to the table? What kinds of things do you want to be sure that you know yourself, so that if this person leaves, you're not in a bind because you've just lost the resources of a key person on your team? If you're going to buy software, what kinds of questions should you be asking of the software? What kinds of things should you be thinking through about your final project? From soup to nuts. What's the structure of the project going to look like? Are there unique pieces to the project that you need to be able to incorporate somehow technologically, sometimes with a survey, for example? You're asking questions that, certain branches of questions are, if you answer yes, these are your questions. If you answer no, these are your questions. Can your software handle that? Do you want to be doing that kind of programming, or would you rather have a service do that kind of programming? If the service does it, are you comfortable with the security of your data? Are you comfortable with the way the data gets delivered to you? Are you ready to cover the costs either way? Those are the kinds of questions that the book will guide you through. People do know how to design a study, and we don't pretend to tell them how to design a study. However, therein is the rub. If you know how to do your research, and you're good at what you do? You jump in and you do it. And there's the problem. Because you're going to jump in and do it in a new venue, using technology, and not think through all of the kinds of challenges that you might have. In fact, because you're an excellent researcher. You don't even think about those things because it's second nature to you. And as you start to embark on technological projects, all of a sudden there's new questions that need to be asked. There's new things that need to be done. So when we talk about designing a study, we're not talking about teaching people literally the nuts and bolts of study design, because we know they know that. We know that they have the ability to design their own study. What we want to do is we want to help infuse the questions in there that deal with technological challenges, so that they don't make costly mistakes, so that they don't discover afterward, gee, why didn't anybody tell me? Why didn't anybody help me think about those kinds of issues? Had I only known before I started my project. So the kinds of things that people might be thinking about with regard to study design that aren't necessarily the kinds of things they normally think about are things like, for example, issues of privacy. We know about privacy, we know how to put our videotapes in the drawer, we know how to put our cassette tapes in the drawer, we know how to put our notes in the drawer and lock them. But what about privacy online? What happens when you're using an online service? Is it private? Can you guarantee privacy to somebody when you're in a chat room? Those are the kinds of questions you need to think about that you might not necessarily think about if you haven't done a technological study before. There's a number of issues that are discussed in the book, and I'd like to give you an example. One of them is, for example, using chat to do focus groups, something that I happen to have done myself. Makes complete sense, right? We'd want to use a chat application to run a focus group, pull together a group of people, run a focus group. However, there are a number of questions that need to be asked, and those are the kinds of things that are addressed in the book. For example, are you prepared to run a chat with an audience that happens to be behind a corporate firewall? If you're recruiting people, if your sample is primarily people who are going to be on the job during the day, they're going to be in their offices. Have you thought about the fact that their companies might not allow chat through the firewall? And in case you're wondering, yes, that has been my experience. I've had that personal experience where I had people who couldn't participate in a chat because their corporations would not allow the chat to function through the firewall. In addition, even if they can function through the firewall, they probably can't download the application. And if they can download the application, they can't install it on their computer because the admin requirements of most corporations don't allow people to use, or the admin privileges, I should say, don't allow people to actually install applications on their corporate-owned computer. So right there's a major problem. Another major challenge for somebody running a focus group is who's going to provide the software support. I assumed when I ran my chats that everybody knew how to use a chat. So why would I need technical support? I ended up, while trying to facilitate a conversation with a dozen people, Also answering technical questions on an ongoing basis for people who are challenged technologically. Again, think about your sample. If your sample's all 15-year-old kids, chances are really good they've all used a chat room. If your sample is mixed corporate executives, give or take, you may or may not find people who are comfortable in a chat environment. Those are the kinds of things that are addressed in the book. This particular book is organized around building a study from beginning to end. The first several chapters are focused on specific questions that have to do with online research. So there's the study design component that we mentioned earlier. There's a section on online ethics. There's a section on privacy and whether or not you can guarantee privacy. Discussion of things like writing informed consent, particularly in a technological environment. Then the chapters get more specific around the technology to help you jump in around the technology. There's a chapter on using email for data collection, a chapter on using chat for doing discussions, focus groups, and interviews, things like that. Then by the end of the book, you have chapters on presenting your data and on creative ways to do research in the online environment. So the idea is to take a researcher from the beginning to the end to ask the kinds of technological questions they might want to ask and get their hands a little bit dirty as they deal with the information and they deal with the technologies involved. Is it going to have a whole bunch of how-tos? No. It's not going to teach you how to use applications, and part of the reason it's not going to teach you how to use applications is, one, there are plenty of good books on the market that do that, and two, it would be outdated tomorrow because of the changes in the technology. The purpose is not to teach you, for example, how to use email. It's to teach you how to think about using email in the context of doing interviews and focus groups. There's a number of ways in which the book is really useful for a broad range of audiences. One of the ways in which the book, I think, is helpful is that if people just kind of scan the book from beginning to end, there's really something in there for everyone. In addition, Tony and I spent a lot of time building up an index and building up a table of contents, specifically so that people could peruse them and find the sections that work for them. Unlike a typical novel or some other kind of book, you typically have to read every chapter because one builds on top of the other. In this particular book, each of the chapters stand alone, covering subject matter, so you could easily read one chapter and then not read any other sections of the book to meet your particular needs. If you only need to know about email in the context of doing interviews and focus groups, why read the rest of the chapters? If you're looking for a good span of information on things like ethical considerations as they pertain to online environments, well, just read the third chapter. Don't read the rest of the book. It focuses in that way. One of the things that people will discover, however, is that a lot of times people who are doing research will think that their data collection is the same regardless of what venues they use. So, for example, if I interview you in a face-to-face interview, how can that change, or how will that change if I do an interview in an email? Some people will think, well, that's just data collection. It's data collection. I've either got your written story typed or I've got your story face-to-face. Well, anybody who's done any kind of research online realizes that's not the case, which means that subtly the research changes. They're not specifically comparable. One of the things that they'll discover in the course of the book is that that's the case. So, for example, if I'm interviewing you face-to-face, I see specific cues that are nonverbal. I watch you nod your head. I see your eyes blink. I watch you smile or not. All of that is lost if I ask you the exact same question in an email interview. So there, right in that context, we see a shift in the way data is collected, therefore making it a different environment than other kinds of research environments. There are sections throughout the book that are specific to particular research needs. But again, the book is organized slightly different than what you might anticipate if you're looking for a methods book. So, for example, you won't go to a chapter called interviewing. You won't go to a chapter called focus groups. What you'll go to is a chapter called email, using email for data collection. And in the chapter on using email for data collection, you'll read about interviewing and you'll read about focus groups. In another chapter on using chat rooms for data collection, you'll read about interviewing and you'll read about focus groups, and so on and so forth. So the methods are weaved throughout the book around the technologies and not the other way around. So it's not like you're going to go to a chapter on interviewing and then read about email and chat rooms. Instead, you're going to go to a chapter on email and read about interviewing and focus groups. As I've noted previously, a reader doesn't need to go through the entire book or read an entire section for their specific needs. There are many ways in the book where they can get focused on the particular tasks that are at hand for them. Tony and I were really clear that what we wanted was we wanted a resource. We wanted a book that would enable people to jump in and look for specific things specific to their particular research needs. So if I'm going to do an online survey, I want to know about online survey tools. I want to know about databases and putting databases online. I want to know about what kinds of questions to ask of a service, the pros and cons of going with a service versus building my own database. Those are the kinds of questions that I want to know. Those have nothing to do with interviewing. They have nothing to do with doing focus groups or other kinds of data collection. They're specific to surveys. So I want to go to a chapter on online surveys. So the book is organized in a way that enables them to do that. In addition to those types of chapters, there's also sections that look at emerging trends. So for example, social networking is an emerging trend. Used to be very popular. Social networking basically exceeded the technological abilities of the times in the 70s, kind of stopped, and is now being revived because we have technology that enables us to look at social networks in new ways. So there's new kinds of technology that are being used to do that kind of research. Other kinds of research is in gaming, for example. We have lots of online game environments, and those games are being developed in some ways to do specific research. And in other ways, those games are just being analyzed, and people are watching people in action using these games and analyzing the ways in which they interface and interact with these games for a number of purposes. So there's all of these kinds of things are discussed in various ways throughout the book, and the book is organized in a way that you can just look for those sections and then extract from those particular sections what you need. Throughout the book, there are breakout boxes that we intentionally organized within the context of the chapters. These breakout boxes come in 3 different flavors. Most of the time they're referred to as tips and tricks, but the 3 flavors are advice, exercises, and sample data. And part of the purpose for that is that, for example, if you read a section that's 4 or 5 pages long on a consent form, when you sit down to write your consent form, what do you want? You want a condensed list of what do I need to work on? What do I need to remember? So there's a breakout box, 1 page long, that you can use to write your consent form. If you're thinking about downloading data, let's say you want to use International Monetary Fund data, and you've never downloaded data before, you have no sense of what that's going to be like. One of the exercises walks you through how to download data, what that data should look like, what some of the questions are going to be when you go to access that data, so that when you go to any other site, you'll know how to download data and you'll know what looks right and what doesn't. Do we think everybody's going to use IMF data? No, of course not. We wanted to use an example so that people could get their feet wet, could actually try an exercise and see how it feels and how it looks, so that when they actually go about doing it themselves, they'll have some sense of what to expect. Similarly, in the context of sample data, let's say you're thinking about doing online focus groups, and you're thinking about using email to do those focus groups. Well, what that means is that when I answer your question, I'm going to tag on your text with my text. So over time, there's going to be 3 or 4 different layers of text from what we call a thread, typically online. And people don't always know what to expect or what that might look like. So there's a couple of places in the book where we highlight that. We give some sample data from studies that one of us has done, and that enables people to then look through that data and go, oh, that's what that's going to look like, and this is what it's going to take to clean it in preparation for analysis. And these are the kinds of things that I should expect and should anticipate when I'm trying to do the same kind of project myself. So again, the boxes come in 3 flavors: advice, exercises, and sample data. The concluding chapter is actually an interesting kind of quandary in some respects. Most of the time when we concluded a book, our summary is our final chapter. So basically the book conclusion says, well, and this is what we learned from the rest of the book. In the case of this particular book, there are a number of topics that we knew were important and that we wanted to make sure we highlighted for people. such as lurking, which really there's a whole lot you can say about lurking. Another example would be interviewing with minors or working with minors in online research. These are important issues, so important that we felt they were a distraction in the context of the text and were things that were beyond the scope of the work, but were important enough for us to bring to people's attention as they were walking away from doing their research. So we wanted to be sure that people understood that these were important, and then if they refer back to the section in the beginning of the book, as well as the bibliography, we have lots and lots of references where people do a much better job with these particular topics than we ever could have done in the context of the book. So while it may feel a little bit like we're opening Pandora's box as we wander into this last section and talk a couple pages at a time about some key issues, we felt strongly that these were important enough issues that we wanted to put them on people's plates and encourage them to do further reading on their own.